Matthew Taylor stood in the doorway of his bedroom, his heart hammering against his ribs as he watched Andrew Martin pace back and forth across the hardwood floor. The late afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows caught the golden highlights in Andrew's dark hair, and Matthew felt that familiar twist of longing in his chest that he had been trying to ignore for months. Andrew had called him 20 minutes ago, his voice tight with some unnamed urgency, saying he needed help with something important. But now that Matthew was here, Andrew seemed to have forgotten entirely what that something was. "I need to tell you something," Andrew had said over the phone, his words rushed and breathless. "Can you come over right now? It's important." Matthew had dropped everything, his pulse quickening with a mixture of hope and terror that maybe, finally, this was the moment he had been waiting for. The moment when Andrew would realize what Matthew had known for the better part of a year. That what existed between them was more than friendship, more than the easy camaraderie of roommates who had somehow become the most important people in each other's lives. But now Andrew was running his hands through his hair, that nervous gesture Matthew knew so well, and shaking his head as if trying to clear it. "I know I called you," Andrew said, his voice strained. "I know I said I needed help with something, but I can't remember what it was. It's like the words just disappeared from my head the moment you walked through that door." Matthew took a careful step into the room, his eyes never leaving Andrew's face. The confusion there was real, but underneath it, Matthew could see something else. Something that made his breath catch in his throat. A kind of desperate longing that mirrored his own, a vulnerability that Andrew rarely let show. "Before we figure out what you needed help with," Matthew said softly, "tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. We love hearing from all of you." But to understand how they had arrived at this moment, with Andrew pacing and Matthew standing frozen in the doorway between friendship and something infinitely more complicated, we need to go back. Back to the beginning, when they were just two college students who happened to need a roommate and found something neither of them had been looking for. It had started 6 months earlier, in the cramped apartment they shared near campus. Matthew had been struggling through his junior year, working 2 part-time jobs to pay for school and barely keeping his head above water academically. He had needed a roommate to split the rent, and Andrew had answered his ad on the university housing board. They had met for coffee on a Tuesday afternoon in October, and Matthew had known within the first 5 minutes that Andrew Martin was going to be trouble for him in ways he couldn't even begin to articulate. Andrew was everything Matthew wasn't. Confident where Matthew was shy, outgoing where Matthew preferred to blend into the background, effortlessly charming in a way that drew people to him like moths to a flame. He was studying business with a minor in communications, planning to work in marketing after graduation, and he talked about his future with the kind of certainty that Matthew envied. Matthew was majoring in English literature, spending most of his free time buried in books, unsure what he wanted to do with his life beyond the vague notion that he wanted to write. They were opposites in almost every way, but somehow it worked. Andrew brought energy and life to their small apartment, filling the space with laughter and music and the constant stream of friends who seemed drawn to his magnetic personality. Matthew provided stability and quiet comfort, someone Andrew could talk to when the weight of being everyone's favorite person became too much to bear. They fell into an easy routine, cooking dinner together most nights, studying at the kitchen table while sharing takeout containers, watching movies on Matthew's laptop when they both needed a break from the stress of school. For the first few months, Matthew told himself that what he felt for Andrew was just friendship. Close friendship, the kind he had never experienced before, but nothing more complicated than that. Andrew was straight after all. He had a girlfriend back home, a pretty blonde named Sarah Hernandez, who visited every few weeks and left traces of her presence throughout the apartment. Her perfume lingering in the bathroom, her hair ties scattered on Andrew's nightstand, her laughter echoing from behind his closed bedroom door. Matthew tried not to think about what happened behind that door. He tried not to notice the way Andrew's face lit up when Sarah called, or the way he would disappear for hours at a time when she was in town. He tried to focus on his classes, his work, his own life, but it was impossible to ignore the growing awareness that what he felt for his roommate was shifting into something deeper and more dangerous. The first crack in Matthew's carefully constructed denial came on a Thursday night in January. Sarah had been visiting for the weekend, and Matthew had made himself scarce, spending most of Saturday and Sunday at the library or walking aimlessly around campus. When he finally returned to the apartment Sunday evening, he found Andrew sitting alone at the kitchen table, staring down at his phone with an expression Matthew had never seen before. "She broke up with me," Andrew said without looking up. "Just like that, out of nowhere. Said she'd been thinking about it for a while, that we want different things, that she needs to focus on herself or some shit like that." Matthew felt his heart do something complicated in his chest, a mixture of sympathy for his friend's pain and something else he didn't want to examine too closely. He sat down across from Andrew, reaching out to touch his hand briefly. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. "Are you okay?" Andrew finally looked up, and Matthew was struck by the confusion in his eyes more than the sadness. "That's the weird part," Andrew said slowly. "I should be devastated, right? We've been together for almost 2 years. But I'm not. I'm sad, but not the way I thought I would be. It's like, I'm more upset about the idea of losing her than actually losing her, if that makes any sense." It made perfect sense to Matthew, though he couldn't say so. He had watched Andrew with Sarah, had seen the way Andrew seemed to be playing a part when she was around. More animated, more traditionally masculine, like he was performing some version of himself that didn't quite fit. When Sarah left, Andrew would always seem to deflate slightly, settling back into the quieter, more thoughtful version of himself that Matthew had come to know and love. Love. The word hit Matthew like a physical blow, and he realized with stunning clarity that he was in love with his straight roommate. Completely, hopelessly, irrevocably in love with Andrew Martin, who was sitting across from him, nursing a broken heart over a woman and would probably never see Matthew as anything more than a friend. The weeks following Andrew's breakup were a special kind of torture for Matthew. Without Sarah's regular presence in the apartment, he and Andrew fell into an even closer intimacy. They spent more time together, talking late into the night about everything and nothing. Andrew seemed to crave Matthew's company in a way that was both wonderful and painful, seeking him out for comfort and conversation in ways that made Matthew's heart race and break simultaneously. Andrew would curl up on the couch next to Matthew while they watched movies, close enough that Matthew could feel the heat radiating from his skin. He would fall asleep there sometimes, his head dropping onto Matthew's shoulder, and Matthew would sit perfectly still for hours, afraid to move and break the spell. In those moments, Matthew would let himself imagine what it might be like if Andrew felt the same way, if the casual touches and intimate conversations meant something more than friendship. But Andrew gave no indication that his feelings for Matthew were anything other than platonic. He talked about getting back into dating, about maybe trying some of the apps his friends recommended. He mentioned women he found attractive, celebrities and classmates, and the barista at the coffee shop they frequented. Each casual comment was like a small knife twisting in Matthew's chest, a reminder that Andrew's romantic interest would always lie elsewhere. Matthew threw himself into his schoolwork and his jobs, trying to create some distance between himself and the growing intensity of his feelings. But it was impossible to avoid Andrew entirely when they shared such a small space. Every morning brought the sight of Andrew stumbling out of his bedroom, hair mussed and wearing nothing but boxer shorts and a t-shirt. Every evening meant cooking dinner together, their hands brushing as they passed ingredients back and forth. Every night meant lying in his bed, separated from Andrew by only a thin wall, listening to the sounds of his roommate moving around his room and wondering what he was thinking about. The breaking point came on a Friday night in March. Matthew had been working a double shift at the campus bookstore and came home exhausted, wanting nothing more than to collapse on his bed and sleep for 12 hours. But when he opened the apartment door, he found Andrew sitting on the couch with his laptop, a half-empty bottle of wine on the coffee table, and an expression of deep concentration on his face. "Hey," Andrew said, looking up with a smile that made Matthew's tired heart skip a beat. "How was work?" "Exhausting," Matthew replied, dropping his bag by the door. "What are you working on?" Andrew's cheeks flushed slightly, and he closed the laptop with a snap. "Nothing important, just research for a class." There was something in Andrew's tone that made Matthew pause. In the months they had been living together, Andrew had never been secretive about his schoolwork. If anything, he was always eager to talk about his projects, bouncing ideas off Matthew and asking for feedback on his presentations. This sudden caginess was completely out of character. "What kind of research?" Matthew asked, settling onto the couch next to Andrew. "Maybe I can help. It's not that kind of research," Andrew said quickly. then seemed to realize how strange that sounded. I mean, it's personal stuff, not school-related. Matthew felt a familiar twist of anxiety in his stomach. Personal research could mean anything. Maybe Andrew was looking into getting back together with Sarah. Maybe he was researching how to ask out someone new. Maybe he had met someone and was trying to figure out how to tell Matthew that he would be spending less time at home. Okay, Matthew said carefully. Well, if you want to talk about it, I'm here. Andrew looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable flickering across his features. Actually, he said slowly, can I ask you something? Something kind of weird. Matthew's heart started beating faster. Sure. Have you ever, Andrew paused, running his hand through his hair in that familiar nervous gesture. Have you ever questioned your sexuality? Like, wondered if maybe you weren't as straight as you thought you were? The question hit Matthew like a lightning bolt. He stared at Andrew, trying to process what he had just heard, wondering if this was some kind of dream or hallucination brought on by exhaustion and months of suppressed longing. Andrew was looking at him with an expression of vulnerable curiosity, waiting for an answer that Matthew wasn't sure he was brave enough to give. Why do you ask? Matthew said finally, his voice carefully neutral. He could feel his pulse hammering in his throat, could hear the blood rushing in his ears. This felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, one wrong word away from either flying or falling. Andrew shifted on the couch, turning to face Matthew more fully. His eyes were bright with wine and something else, something that made Matthew's breath catch. I've been thinking about it lately, Andrew said, since Sarah and I broke up. Actually, if I'm being honest, I was thinking about it before we broke up. Maybe that's why we broke up. Matthew felt like the world had tilted on its axis. Everything he thought he knew about Andrew, about their relationship, about the careful boundaries he had built around his feelings, suddenly seemed uncertain. What do you mean? He asked. Andrew took a sip of wine, his hand trembling slightly. I keep thinking about this thing Sarah said, right before she ended things. She said it felt like I was holding back, like there was some part of myself I wasn't sharing with her. And she was right, there was. But I didn't understand what it was until after she left. Matthew waited, afraid to breathe, afraid to move, afraid to do anything that might break this moment and send Andrew retreating back into the safety of casual friendship. I've been doing research, Andrew continued, his voice gaining strength. Reading about sexuality and identity and all this stuff I never really thought about before. And I keep coming across this term, compulsory heterosexuality. The idea that sometimes people think they're straight because that's what they're supposed to be, not because that's what they actually are. The words hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility and danger. Matthew felt like he was standing at a crossroads, with one path leading back to the comfortable lie of friendship and another leading into completely unknown territory. And what did you discover? Matthew asked softly. Andrew met his eyes, and Matthew saw his own longing reflected there. I discovered that every relationship I've ever had with a woman felt like I was playing a part, like I was following a script someone else had written for me. Even with Sarah, who I cared about, it never felt completely real. It felt like I was performing being in love instead of actually being in love. Matthew's heart was beating so hard he was sure Andrew could hear it. And now he managed to ask, now I'm wondering if maybe I've been looking for love in the wrong places, Andrew said, with the wrong people. The silence that followed was charged with electricity, with years of unspoken feelings and careful pretense finally beginning to crack open. Matthew could see the fear in Andrew's eyes, the vulnerability of someone who had just revealed their deepest uncertainty. He could also see hope there, fragile and tentative, but unmistakably real. Andrew, Matthew said, his voice barely above a whisper, what are you saying? I'm saying that when I think about the person who makes me feel most like myself, the person I'm most comfortable with, the person I look forward to seeing every day. Andrew paused, his eyes never leaving Matthew's face. I'm saying that person is you. The words hit Matthew like a physical force, knocking the breath from his lungs. For a moment, he couldn't speak, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stare at Andrew and try to process what he had just heard. This was everything he had dreamed of and never dared to hope for, the confession he had imagined 1,000 times, but never believed would actually happen. Me, Matthew repeated, his voice cracking slightly. You, Andrew confirmed. And I know this is crazy, and I know it might ruin everything between us, but I can't stop thinking about what it would be like to kiss you. The confession hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Matthew felt tears pricking at the corners of his eyes, overwhelmed by the sudden shift from hopeless longing to impossible possibility. For months, he had been carrying the weight of his secret feelings, convinced that Andrew would never see him as anything more than a friend. Now Andrew was sitting inches away, having just admitted to wanting the same thing Matthew had been dreaming about. Andrew, Matthew said again, reaching out to touch Andrew's hand where it rested on the couch between them. Their fingers intertwined naturally, as if they had been doing this for years instead of crossing this line for the first time. I've been in love with you for months. Andrew's eyes widened, and Matthew saw a mixture of relief and wonder cross his features. You have. Since about 2 weeks after you moved in, Matthew admitted, feeling lighter with each word. I tried so hard to convince myself it was just friendship, especially when you were with Sarah. But I couldn't stop thinking about you, couldn't stop wanting to be close to you. When you would fall asleep on the couch during our movie nights, I would stay awake for hours just watching you breathe. Andrew's grip on Matthew's hand tightened. I thought I was going crazy, Andrew said. These past few months, especially after Sarah left, I kept finding excuses to spend time with you. I would make up problems just so I could ask for your help, just so I could have your attention focused on me. Is that what tonight was? Matthew asked, remembering Andrew's phone call, his claim that he needed help with something he couldn't remember. Andrew's cheeks flushed pink. Maybe. I called you because I wanted to tell you how I was feeling. But then, when you actually showed up, I lost my nerve. I couldn't remember what excuse I had used to get you here. They were sitting so close now that Matthew could see the flecks of gold in Andrew's brown eyes, could smell the familiar scent of his shampoo mixed with the wine on his breath. The air between them felt charged, electric with possibility, and the weight of finally spoken truths. What happens now? Matthew asked. Andrew lifted his free hand to cup Matthew's face, his thumb brushing across Matthew's cheekbone in a gesture so tender it made Matthew's heart ache. Now we figure it out together, Andrew said, if you want to. Matthew leaned into the touch, closing his eyes for a moment to savor the feeling of Andrew's skin against his. When he opened them again, Andrew was looking at him with an expression of such open affection that it took Matthew's breath away. I want to, Matthew said. I want to try this with you. Andrew smiled, and it was like the sun coming out after a storm. Can I kiss you? He asked, his voice soft and uncertain. Matthew nodded, not trusting his voice. Andrew leaned forward slowly, giving Matthew plenty of time to change his mind, to pull away, and to retreat back into the safety of friendship. But Matthew didn't want safety anymore. He wanted this, wanted Andrew, wanted to finally close the distance between what was and what could be. When Andrew's lips touched his, it was gentle at first, tentative and questioning. But when Matthew kissed back, when his hand came up to tangle in Andrew's hair and pull him closer, the kiss deepened into something more certain, more desperate. It was everything Matthew had imagined and nothing like he had expected, soft and urgent and perfect in its imperfection. They broke apart after what felt like hours, but had probably been only seconds, both breathing hard, foreheads pressed together. Andrew's eyes were wide with wonder, his lips slightly swollen from the kiss. Wow, Andrew breathed. Yeah, Matthew agreed, unable to keep the smile off his face. Wow. They stayed on the couch talking until nearly 3 a.m, hands intertwined, sharing stories and fears and hopes they had never voiced before. Andrew talked about the pressure he had always felt to be the perfect straight guy, the way he had forced himself into relationships that felt hollow and performative. Matthew shared his own journey of self-discovery, the years of questioning and uncertainty before he had finally accepted his sexuality, the loneliness of keeping such a fundamental part of himself hidden. I was so scared you would figure it out, Matthew admitted as they finally made their way to their respective bedrooms. I thought if you knew how I felt, it would make you uncomfortable. That you'd want to find a new roommate. Andrew stopped in the hallway between their doors, turning to face Matthew. I could never want that, he said firmly. You're the best thing that's happened to me in years. Even if this, he gestured between them, even if this doesn't work out the way we hope, I never want to lose you as a friend. It will work out, Matthew said with more confidence than he felt. We'll make it work. Andrew smiled and leaned forward to press a soft kiss to Matthew's lips, a goodnight kiss that sent warmth spreading through Matthew's entire body. Sweet dreams, Andrew murmured against his mouth. Matthew lay awake for hours that night, replaying every moment of their conversation, every touch, every look that had passed between them. He felt like he was living in a dream, afraid that if he fell asleep, he would wake up to find that none of it had been real. But when morning came and he heard Andrew moving around in the kitchen, making coffee and humming softly to himself, Matthew knew that this was his new reality. He found Andrew standing at the counter, already dressed for his Saturday morning jog, 2 mugs of coffee waiting on the counter. Andrew looked up when Matthew entered, and his face broke into a smile so bright it made Matthew's heart skip. "Good morning," Andrew said, and there was something different in his voice, something warm and intimate that hadn't been there before. "Morning," Matthew replied, accepting the mug Andrew offered him. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, and Matthew felt that same electric spark from the night before. "I was thinking," Andrew said, leaning against the counter, "maybe we should take this slow, figure out what this means for us without rushing into anything." Matthew nodded, though part of him wanted to rush headlong into whatever this was becoming. But Andrew was right. They had been friends and roommates for months, and that foundation was too important to risk by moving too fast. "What does slow look like?" Matthew asked. Andrew considered this, taking a sip of his coffee. "Maybe we keep doing what we've been doing, but with the understanding that we're exploring something more. Maybe we go on actual dates instead of just hanging out. Maybe we tell people we're together when we're ready." The word "together" sent a thrill through Matthew that he tried to keep from showing on his face. "You want to tell people?" Eventually, Andrew said, "When we're sure about what we are. I don't want to hide this, Matthew." "I don't want to hide you." They spent that Saturday together doing the same things they had done dozens of times before, but with an entirely new awareness of each other. They went grocery shopping, cooked lunch together, watched a movie on the couch. But now when Andrew's hand found his during the movie, it wasn't accidental. When Andrew leaned against him while they cooked, it was intentional. Every touch, every look, every moment of closeness carried the weight of their new understanding. The following weeks passed in a haze of discovery and tentative joy. They went on their first official date to a small Italian restaurant downtown, both nervous and excited in a way that made Matthew feel like a teenager again. Andrew held his hand across the table while they waited for their food, his thumb tracing patterns on Matthew's knuckles, and Matthew thought he might actually combust from happiness. They were careful to maintain the boundaries Andrew had suggested, taking things slowly and checking in with each other constantly. But those boundaries became harder to maintain as they grew more comfortable with this new dynamic. The goodnight kisses lasted longer. The casual touches became more frequent and more lingering. The way they looked at each other carried an intensity that made Matthew's pulse race. 3 weeks after their first kiss, Andrew came home from class to find Matthew grading papers at the kitchen table. His brow furrowed in concentration as he worked through a stack of freshman composition essays. Andrew dropped his backpack by the door and came to stand behind Matthew's chair, his hands settling on Matthew's shoulders. "Rough day?" Andrew asked, beginning to massage the tension from Matthew's neck and shoulders. Matthew leaned into the touch, closing his eyes as Andrew's strong hands worked out the knots of stress. "Just the usual," he said, trying to explain to 18-year-olds why their thesis statements need to actually make an argument. Andrew laughed, the sound warm and fond. "You're so patient with them. I would have given up after the first essay about how Shakespeare is boring and irrelevant." Matthew tilted his head back to look at Andrew, who was smiling down at him with an expression of such affection that it made Matthew's breath catch. "Sometimes I think about giving up," Matthew admitted. "But then I remember that someone believed in me when I was 18 and struggling with my own writing, and it makes me want to be that person for them." Andrew's hands stilled on Matthew's shoulders, and his expression grew serious. "You're incredible," he said softly. "Do you know that?" Matthew felt heat rise in his cheeks. Andrew had been more free with compliments since they had started whatever this was, but Matthew still wasn't used to being looked at like he was something precious and wonderful. "Andrew," Matthew started to say, but Andrew was already leaning down, pressing a kiss to the top of Matthew's head, then another to his temple, then one more to the sensitive spot just behind his ear that made Matthew shiver. "I love you," Andrew murmured against Matthew's skin, so quietly that Matthew almost thought he had imagined it. Matthew's heart stopped, then started again at double speed. He twisted in his chair to face Andrew fully, searching his face for any sign that he had misspoken or wasn't sure about what he had just said. But Andrew's eyes were clear and certain, full of the same overwhelming emotion that Matthew had been carrying for months. "I love you too," Matthew said, his voice thick with feeling. "I have for so long." Andrew cupped Matthew's face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away tears that Matthew hadn't realized were falling. "I'm sorry it took me so long to figure it out," Andrew said. "I'm sorry you had to wait for me." Matthew shook his head, covering Andrew's hands with his own. "You were worth waiting for. This is worth waiting for." Andrew kissed him then, soft and sweet and full of promise. When they broke apart, Andrew rested his forehead against Matthew's, both of them breathing unsteadily. "I want to take you to bed," Andrew said, his voice rough with want. "Not for sex, just to hold you, to fall asleep with you and wake up next to you. Is that okay?" Matthew nodded, not trusting his voice. They had been dancing around this level of intimacy for weeks, both wanting it but afraid to push too far too fast. But this felt right, felt like the natural progression of everything they had been building together. Andrew's room was dimly lit by the late afternoon sun filtering through his curtains. Matthew had been in here before, of course, but never like this, never with the knowledge that he was welcome here, that this space could be theirs to share. Andrew seemed nervous as he pulled back the covers on his bed, and Matthew realized that this was as new and uncertain for Andrew as it was for him. They lay down together carefully, both still fully clothed, Andrew's arm coming around Matthew to pull him close. Matthew settled against Andrew's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, feeling the rise and fall of his breathing. It was intimate in a way that had nothing to do with sex and everything to do with trust, with the willingness to be vulnerable with another person. "Is this weird?" Andrew asked after a few minutes of comfortable silence. "No," Matthew said, pressing a kiss to Andrew's collarbone through his shirt. "It feels right." They talked quietly as the sun set outside Andrew's window, sharing memories and fears and dreams for the future. Andrew talked about his worries about coming out to his family, his uncertainty about how his friends would react. Matthew shared his own experiences with coming out, the mixture of relief and terror that had accompanied each conversation. "My parents will be okay with it," Andrew said eventually. "They've always been pretty progressive. But my friends from high school, some of them, I don't know how they'll take it. The people who really care about you will want you to be happy," Matthew said. "And the people who don't, well, maybe they weren't really your friends to begin with." Andrew was quiet for a long moment, his hand stroking through Matthew's hair. "What about us?" he asked. "What do we tell people about us?" Matthew lifted his head to look at Andrew. "What do you want to tell them?" "That you're my boyfriend," Andrew said without hesitation. "That I'm completely gone for you and have been for months without realizing it. That you're the best thing that's ever happened to me." Matthew felt his heart swell with so much love he thought it might burst. "Then that's what we tell them," he said. They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other in Andrew's bed, and Matthew woke the next morning to the feeling of Andrew's lips pressed against his forehead and the sound of his name being whispered like a prayer. It was the most perfect morning of Matthew's life. The transition from friends to boyfriends wasn't without its challenges. They had to navigate the shift in their dynamic while still maintaining their friendship, still being roommates, still sharing the small space of their apartment. There were moments of awkwardness, times when they weren't sure how to act around each other, times when the newness of their relationship felt overwhelming. But there were also moments of perfect clarity, when everything felt exactly as it should be. Like the evening Andrew came home with flowers just because he had seen them and thought of Matthew. Like the morning Matthew woke up early to make Andrew's favorite breakfast before a big presentation. Like the night they slow danced in their tiny kitchen to music playing from Matthew's phone, both of them laughing at the ridiculousness and romance of it. 6 weeks after their first kiss, they had their first fight. It was about something stupid, a misunderstanding about plans they had made with friends, but it escalated quickly into something bigger. Andrew accused Matthew of being jealous and possessive. Matthew accused Andrew of being thoughtless and inconsiderate. They both said things they didn't mean. Both retreated to their respective corners to nurse their wounded pride. Matthew spent the night on the couch, staring at the ceiling, and wondering if they had ruined everything by trying to turn their friendship into something more. He could hear Andrew moving around in his room, probably having the same doubts, probably regretting the whole thing. But in the morning, Andrew appeared in the kitchen with red eyes and messy hair, looking as miserable as Matthew felt. "I'm sorry," Andrew said without preamble. "I was an ass last night. I don't want to fight with you." "I'm sorry too," Matthew replied, setting down his coffee mug and opening his arms. Andrew fell into them gratefully, and they held each other in the morning light, both relieved to discover that their relationship was strong enough to survive disagreement. Spring turned to summer, and their relationship deepened and strengthened with each passing day. They developed their own rhythms and traditions, their own private jokes and shared references. Andrew met Matthew's parents during a weekend visit, and while Matthew had been nervous about the introduction, his parents took to Andrew immediately. His mother pulled Matthew aside before they left and told him she had never seen him so happy, so relaxed and confident in himself. Andrew's coming out to his own family happened gradually, in stages. First to his sister, who had apparently been wondering when he was going to figure it out, then to his parents, who surprised him with their immediate acceptance and their request to meet Matthew as soon as possible. Finally, to his extended family and high school friends, some of whom were supportive and others who quietly faded from his life. It hurt, losing some of those friendships, but Andrew handled it with a grace that made Matthew fall even more in love with him. He's choosing authenticity over comfort, Matthew thought. Watching Andrew navigate the sometimes painful process of living openly, he's choosing to be himself even when it's hard. They spent the summer working and taking summer classes, but also exploring their relationship in new ways. They went on weekend trips to nearby cities, spent lazy afternoons in parks and museums, hosted dinner parties for the friends who had embraced their relationship. Matthew watched Andrew bloom in ways he had never seen before, becoming more confident and self-assured as he grew comfortable with this new understanding of himself. One evening in July, they were lying in bed together, Andrew's head on Matthew's chest, both of them drowsy and content after a long day. Matthew was running his fingers through Andrew's hair, marveling as he did every day at the fact that this was his life now, that he got to have this. "Matthew," Andrew said suddenly, his voice serious. Matthew hummed, not opening his eyes. "I want to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Matthew's eyes snapped open, and he looked down at Andrew with concern. "Okay." Andrew lifted his head to meet Matthew's gaze. "Do you ever regret it? This? Us? Do you ever wish we had stayed friends?" The question hit Matthew like a physical blow. "Never," he said immediately, his voice fierce with conviction. "Not for a single second, do you?" Andrew shook his head, but Matthew could see uncertainty in his eyes. "Sometimes I wonder if I've been selfish," Andrew said, "taking your friendship and asking for more. What if I ruin this? What if I'm not good at being with a man? What if I hurt you?" Matthew sat up, pulling Andrew with him so they were facing each other. "Hey," he said, cupping Andrew's face in his hands. "Look at me." Andrew met his eyes reluctantly. "You are not selfish for wanting love," Matthew said firmly. "You are not selfish for being honest about your feelings. And you could never ruin this, because this isn't something that happened to us. It's something we built together, something we choose every day." "But what if I'm not enough?" Andrew whispered. "What if I can't be what you need?" Matthew felt his heart break a little at the vulnerability in Andrew's voice. "You are everything I need," he said. "You are everything I never knew I wanted. I have never been happier than I am with you." Andrew's eyes filled with tears, and he leaned forward to press his forehead against Matthew's. "I love you so much it scares me sometimes," Andrew said. "I've never felt anything like this before." "That's because this is real," Matthew said. "This is what love is supposed to feel like. Overwhelming and terrifying and perfect all at the same time." They held each other in the darkness of Andrew's room, both crying a little, both overwhelmed by the intensity of what they had found together. Matthew thought about all the nights he had lain in his own bed, aching with longing for the man who now lay in his arms. He thought about all the careful walls he had built around his heart, all the ways he had protected himself from hoping for too much. The start of their senior year brought new challenges and new joys. They were both busy with advanced classes and internships, preparing for life after graduation. There were nights when they barely saw each other, passing like ships in their small apartment as they rushed between commitments. But there were also moments of perfect connection. Stolen kisses in the kitchen before class, late night conversations when they both got home exhausted, but still wanted to share their days with each other. Matthew was working on his senior thesis, a collection of short stories that his advisor thought might be good enough to submit to literary magazines. Andrew was completing an internship at a marketing firm downtown, already fielding job offers for after graduation. They were both stressed and excited about the future, but also sad about the approaching end of their college years. "What happens after graduation?" Andrew asked one evening in October. They were studying together at the kitchen table, books and papers spread between them, the comfortable chaos of academic life surrounding them. "What do you mean?" Matthew said, though he knew exactly what Andrew meant. They had been dancing around this conversation for weeks, both afraid to voice their concerns about what would happen when their current life came to an end. "I mean, do we stay together? Do we try to find jobs in the same city? Do we move in together for real instead of just being roommates who happen to be dating?" Matthew set down his pen and looked at Andrew across the table. "What do you want to happen?" Andrew was quiet for a long moment, his fingers playing with the edge of his textbook. "I want us to build a life together," he said finally. "I want to wake up next to you every morning and come home to you every night. I want to figure out how to be adults together." Matthew felt relief wash over him. He had been afraid that Andrew might see graduation as a natural ending point for their relationship, a convenient time to go their separate ways and explore other options. The fact that Andrew wanted the same future Matthew had been dreaming of felt like a gift. "I want that too," Matthew said. "All of it." They spent the rest of the evening making plans, talking about cities they might want to live in, the kind of apartment they could afford together, how they would handle the transition from college to the real world. It felt like planning a life, like building something permanent and meaningful together. The months that followed were a blur of applications and interviews and decisions. Matthew was accepted to several graduate programs, but ultimately decided to defer for a year, wanting to focus on his writing and figure out his next steps. Andrew received multiple job offers and chose a position with a marketing firm in Portland, a city they had both fallen in love with during a spring break visit. They found an apartment together, a small one-bedroom in a neighborhood full of coffee shops and bookstores and young professionals. Moving in together felt different from being roommates, more intentional and committed. They bought furniture together, hung pictures on the walls, created a space that belonged to both of them. Their first night in the new apartment, they sat on their new couch in their empty living room, eating takeout Chinese food and marveling at the fact that they had actually done it. They had built a life together, had chosen each other not just as boyfriends, but as partners. "I can't believe this is real," Andrew said, looking around at their space. "A year ago, I thought I was straight. I thought I was going to marry Sarah and have the most conventional life imaginable." "Do you miss it?" Matthew asked. "The simplicity of that life?" Andrew considered this seriously, as he always did when Matthew asked him difficult questions. "Sometimes I miss the certainty," he said. "It was easier when I thought I had everything figured out. But I wouldn't trade this for anything." "I wouldn't trade you for anything." They settled into their new life with surprising ease. Andrew thrived in his job, quickly proving himself to be creative and hardworking and ambitious. Matthew found work at a local bookstore while he worked on his writing, spending his days surrounded by books and his evenings crafting stories at the small desk they had set up in their bedroom. Their relationship continued to deepen and evolve. They learned how to fight fairly, how to give each other space when they needed it, how to support each other through stress and disappointment and success. They made friends with other couples, hosted dinner parties in their tiny dining room, created traditions and inside jokes and shared memories. On the anniversary of their first kiss, Andrew surprised Matthew with a weekend trip to the coast. They stayed in a small bed and breakfast overlooking the ocean, spent their days walking on the beach and their evenings talking by the fireplace in their room. On their last night, as they lay in bed listening to the sound of waves outside their window, Andrew turned to Matthew with an expression of such love and contentment that it took Matthew's breath away. "I have something to tell you," Andrew said, his voice soft in the darkness. Matthew's heart skipped, but Andrew's tone was warm, not worried. "What is it?" "I've been thinking about that night when I called you and said I needed help with something, then couldn't remember what it was when you got there." Matthew smiled at the memory, the night that started everything. I lied, Andrew said. I did remember what I wanted help with. I wanted help figuring out how to tell you I was falling in love with you. But when you actually showed up, when you were standing there in my doorway looking so beautiful and concerned, I lost my nerve completely. Matthew turned to face Andrew fully, reaching out to touch his face. So you did know what you needed help with. I needed help being brave enough to change my life, Andrew said. I needed help taking the biggest risk I'd ever taken. And somehow just having you there, just knowing that you cared enough to drop everything and come when I called, that was all the help I needed. Matthew kissed him then, soft and slow, and full of all the love he had carried for this man through months of uncertainty and hope and fear. When they broke apart, they were both smiling. I love you, Matthew said, the words as natural as breathing now. I love you too, Andrew replied. Thank you for helping me figure out who I was supposed to be. They lay in each other's arms as the ocean whispered outside their window. Two people who had found their way to each other through confusion and friendship, and the kind of love that changes everything. Matthew thought about all the ways their story could have gone differently, all the moments when either of them could have chosen safety over truth, comfort over growth. But they had chosen each other again and again through every uncertainty and fear. They had chosen to be brave, to be honest, to build something beautiful and lasting together. And as Matthew drifted off to sleep in Andrew's arms, he knew with absolute certainty that he would choose Andrew again in every lifetime, in every universe, in every possible version of their story. The morning sun streaming through their window found them still entwined, still choosing each other, still writing the story of their love one day at a time. And Matthew knew that this was just the beginning, that they had a whole lifetime of mornings and choices in love stretching out before them. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories are the ones that catch you completely off guard, the ones that begin with a phone call about needing help with something and end with two people discovering that what they really needed help with was learning how to love themselves enough to love each other completely.